Hi everyone, today I wanted to share with you some more tips on best settings for birds in flight photography. And a lot of these suggestions came from viewers like yourself in the comment sections of my last video on best settings for birds in flight photography. I also got a question about using the 75 to 300 millimeter with the OM-1 for birds in flight photography. So I've done it many times before, but I did take it out again a couple of days last week just to kind of refresh my memory, and I'll share with you my thoughts and experience with that. Now, the two recommendations that I saw over and over again had to do with the shutter mode and the image stabilization. So let's talk about the shutter mode first. In my last video, I had recommended using just silent sequential shutter mode because this runs at a maximum of 20 frames per second. And the rationale was to basically slow the camera down so that the lens autofocusing motors can keep up with the autofocusing system of the Olympus OM-1. And also, you'll have a lot less images to call through when you get home. You know, we're talking about maybe going only through a few hundred versus several thousand potentially. However, many had recommended using SH2, and this is perfectly fine. This runs at two different shutter speeds, 25 frames per second, or if you have a compatible lens, 50 frames per second. And I never use 50 frames per second unless I'm doing maybe a hummingbird or a kingfisher diving into the water. But in any case, the difference between 25 frames per second and 20 frames per second is not that much, especially when you're just doing short bursts of 1 or 2 seconds for your birds in flight. But the key advantage of SH2 is that the live view and or the EVF does not flicker while you're doing your continuous shooting. So let me put this back into silent sequential and see if I can demonstrate that. So I'm going to press and hold the shutter button down, and you should see the screen flickering. And as you can see, the buffer meter up here is going. So that's what happens when you're shooting in silent sequential, whether you're looking at the live view or more specifically in the EVF. And this can be very, very distracting to some. It's never bothered me personally, but basically the screen goes blank every time the camera captures an image, and it's doing it at 20 frames per second. When you go into SH2, watch what happens. There's no flicker. The only way you know that you're taking pictures is by the buffer counter up here, and the fact that all the information disappears off the screen. So a lot of people prefer this because it's easier to keep track of your subject as it's flying or moving around the frame, and it's also a lot less distracting. Now, the other suggestion I received was to turn off image stabilization. In my last video, I'd recommended to put it into SIS Auto, but many people recommended just turning image stabilization off. And this makes sense when you're shooting at 1/2000th of a second or higher. In that case, even with the 300mm f4 Pro, or maybe if you have the 150 to 400, 1/2000th a second is more than fast enough to minimize or completely eliminate any kind of shake or motion blur that might be generated by you holding the camera. Now, I have seen examples on other camera systems where if you have your image stabilization turned on and you're panning or making fast movements with your camera while you're taking pictures, the image stabilization will actually work against you and introduce motion blur into the image. Now, I've never had that problem with the OM-1 or really any Olympus camera system that I've used, but I did see a video recently where someone compared the Canon R6 versus the Canon R7, and the Canon R7 actually did introduce motion blur time to time when the image stabilization was on, whereas the Canon R6 did not. And I would say that with the OM-1, I never saw any interference. But like I said, if you turn off image stabilization, you probably won't run into any problems when your shutter speeds are like 1/2000th or faster. Now, in my last video, I talked about setting lever position 1 to be all points and lever position 2 to be a single point. So what I mean is the target area would be all points in position 1, and if we flip to position 2, it's going to be this small point. And in that video, I talked about switching from, say, all points to the small point to switch to, say, maybe a bird on a stick type photography very quickly without having to change modes or go into the super control panel, etc. But on my recent trip out, I found it's also very handy to have a small point for when the bird is very far away and there's a lot of distracting elements between you and the bird. Take the scenario here where the bird detect picked up the bird right away, but then it got just as quickly distracted by all these things in the foreground that might look like birds to the camera for some reason. And, I ended up actually getting a good shot out of this, but here's another example where it's actually picking up things in the background. Now it's getting the bird most of the time, but it will jump to the background sometimes. And as you can see, it did just there. So being able to quickly flip the lever to position 2 like I did here allows you to put the target point right over the bird so that it doesn't get distracted by all the other things in the frame. Alright, now let's talk briefly about the 75-300. This lens is a tremendous bargain. I got mine used in mint condition for like $400 a few years ago, and you can get these brand new on sale for about $450, and without any discounts it's only like $550. Certainly a lot cheaper than my 300mm f4 Pro, which is like $3,000. And you can still get fabulous images from this lens. It's very, very sharp. The only caveat is that at the long end at 300mm, you lose about 1 1/3 stop of light because of the aperture. And that's going to more than double your ISO when you're taking pictures. So you need to be in pretty good light to get the best images out of this. But that said, I took it out for a couple of days in just kind of average light, even I would say poor lighting conditions, and I was still able to pull out decent images. And especially if the bird can fill at least 25% of the frame. Some of the images you're going to see in my montage, the bird is only less than 1 megapixel in the frame. But they still came out pretty nice, I think. So I put together another montage. Seemed like many of you liked that, and I really appreciate the very kind words on the last video where I did this. But basically, you're going to see what the camera sees with all of the exposure information and tracking boxes and things, how the camera is actually going to perform with the 75-300. And then you'll see the raw images with a short clip of the editing, and then the final image output that I would deliver, say, to Instagram, whatever. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you find these videos helpful. If so, consider buying me a coffee or making a small donation and links below, because they help me to continue making videos like this, and they're greatly appreciated. So thanks again, and I hope to see you again soon.